In the year 1296, a Chinese diplomat named Zhu Daguan arrived by boat at the sprawling capital of the Khmer Empire. He had traveled for months from the southeastern coast of China, sailing through the South China Sea, navigating the Mekong River, and finally crossing the vast Tonle Sap Lake to reach his destination. What he encountered upon arrival would later become the only surviving eyewitness account of one of history's most remarkable urban achievements. Zhou described a city unlike anything else in the medieval world. Angkor, as it was known, stretched across more than 1,000 square kilometers of carefully engineered landscape. At its heart stood the walled royal enclosure of Angkor Thom, its gates crowned with massive stone faces gazing outward in every direction. Beyond the walls, an intricate network of canals, reservoirs, and embankments connected temples, neighborhoods, and agricultural lands in a web of infrastructure that had no equal anywhere on Earth. The population, sustained by this elaborate system, may have approached 1 million people, making Angkor by far the largest city of the pre-industrial world. Zhao stayed for 11 months, living in a house near the north gate of Angkor. He watched royal processions pass through the streets, observed markets where women spread their wares on mats across the ground, and noted how the rhythms of daily life revolved around the movement of water through the city. Every aspect of existence in Angkor depended on the careful management of a resource that arrived in abundance during the monsoon season and became desperately scarce during the long months of drought that followed. What Zhou could not have known was that he was witnessing Angkor near the end of its golden age. Within a few decades of his departure, the city would begin a long, slow transformation that would eventually see its political center relocate southward, its great reservoirs fall into disrepair, and its monumental temples become overgrown with forest. The causes of this transformation have puzzled historians for generations. But modern science has now revealed a story far more complex and instructive than simple conquest or decline. It is a story about the relationship between human ambition and environmental limits, about the choices societies make when the systems they depend upon begin to fail, and about the consequences of responding too slowly to forces that demand adaptation. The origins of Angkor lay in a sacred ceremony held atop a mountain in the year 802. There, a prince named Jayavarman II declared himself Chakravartin, a universal ruler, and Devaraja, a god-king. This act marked the formal beginning of the Khmer Empire, a political entity that would eventually control much of mainland Southeast Asia. But Jayavarman II's accomplishment was more than ceremonial. He unified competing regional powers and established a system of divine kingship that would provide legitimacy to his successors for more than 6 centuries. The early Khmer kings understood from the beginning that their power depended on water. The region they inhabited received most of its annual rainfall during the monsoon season, which lasted roughly from May to November. During these months, the Tonle Sap Lake swelled to 5 times its dry season size, as water from the Mekong River reversed course and flowed backward into the basin. This natural phenomenon created conditions favorable for rice cultivation, but it also presented challenges. Floods could destroy crops and settlements. Droughts could bring famine. The task of the Khmer state was to tame this variability, to store water when it was abundant and distribute it when it was scarce. The solution, developed over centuries, involved 3 integrated systems. First, upstream channels and embankments diverted water flowing from the hills north of the city, redirecting it toward the central urban zone. Second, massive reservoirs called bere stored this water for use during the dry season. The largest of these, the West Bere, measured 8 kilometers long and more than 2 kilometers wide, with a capacity of nearly 50 million cubic meters. Third, downstream channels carried surplus water away to the Tonle Sap Lake, preventing flooding while maintaining the delicate balance the system required. This infrastructure represented an engineering achievement of extraordinary sophistication. The bere were not simply holes dug in the ground, but carefully constructed basins with embankments designed to withstand the pressure of immense volumes of water. The channels connecting them featured automated spillways that directed water between different parts of the network based on prevailing conditions. At key junctions, laterite blocks were cut with interlocking grooves to prevent movement under the force of flowing water. The entire system required constant maintenance, a workforce of thousands, and centralized coordination that only a powerful state could provide. For several centuries, this system functioned remarkably well. The wetter conditions that prevailed during the medieval warm period provided reliable monsoon rains, and the Khmer engineers proved adept at expanding and modifying their infrastructure to meet growing demands. Each successive king constructed new temples and new barae, demonstrating both piety and power through monumental building projects. The greatest of these, Angkor Wat, was built during the reign of Suryavarman II in the early 12th century. This temple complex, dedicated to the Hindu god Vishnu, covered more than 160 hectares and required decades to complete. Its construction employed vast quantities of sandstone transported from quarries more than 30 kilometers away, along with the labor of hundreds of thousands of workers. The reign of Jayavarman VII in the late 12th and early 13th centuries marked the zenith of Khmer power. This king, who converted the state religion to Mahayana Buddhism, embarked on a building program of unprecedented scale. He constructed the Bayon Temple at the center of Angkor Thom, with its famous towers of enigmatic stone faces. He built Ta Prohm and Priya Khan, dedicating them to his parents. He established hospitals and rest houses along the roads that connected the capital to the provinces. And he expanded the empire's territory to its greatest extent, incorporating lands that today belong to Thailand, Laos, Vietnam, and Myanmar. But this frenzy of construction came at a cost. The infrastructure grew so large and complex that it became increasingly difficult to maintain. The water management system, originally designed for a smaller city, was repeatedly modified and expanded to serve a population and urban area that had grown far beyond its original parameters. By the time Zhou Daguan visited Angkor at the end of the 13th century, the great age of temple building had ended. No new barae had been constructed for decades. The last known inscription recording the consecration of a monument at Angkor dates to 1295, just 1 year before Zhu's arrival. The climate in Southeast Asia began to shift in the mid-14th century. Tree ring records from ancient cypress trees in Vietnam, some more than 700 years old, reveal that the region experienced 2 prolonged droughts of exceptional severity during this period. The first lasted approximately 30 years, the second roughly 20. These were not ordinary dry spells, but megadroughts of a magnitude that would have tested any society's capacity to adapt. The causes of these droughts appear linked to large-scale patterns in Pacific Ocean temperatures. During El Niño events, when the tropical Pacific warms, monsoon rains over Southeast Asia typically weaken. The 14th and 15th centuries saw a transition from the wetter conditions of the medieval warm period to the drier climate of the Little Ice Age, a shift associated with more frequent and intense El Niño episodes. For a civilization built on the assumption of regular, abundant monsoon rainfall, this change posed an existential challenge. The droughts would have devastated Angkor in multiple ways. Agricultural productivity depended on sufficient water for rice cultivation, and extended dry periods would have caused crop failures on a massive scale. The population density of the city, which concentrated hundreds of thousands of people in a relatively confined area, would have exacerbated the effects of food shortages and increased vulnerability to disease. The barae, designed to store monsoon rainfall for distribution during the dry season, would have been unable to replenish their reserves when the rains failed year after year. Archaeological evidence suggests that Khmer engineers attempted to respond to these changing conditions. They modified existing channels to capture every available drop of water. They constructed new diversions to redirect flow from areas of surplus to areas of need. These adaptations represented rational responses to environmental stress, the kind of incremental adjustments that had served the empire well during previous centuries of expansion and growth. But the droughts of the 14th century were followed by something potentially more destructive, a series of unusually intense monsoon seasons that brought sudden, overwhelming floods. The tree ring records show that 6 of the 20 wettest years in the entire 750-year sequence occurred during the late 14th and early 15th centuries, punctuating the long dry periods with violent reversals. This pattern of extreme variability, swinging from severe drought to catastrophic flood, proved devastating to infrastructure that had been designed for more predictable conditions. The hydraulic system that had sustained Angkor for centuries began to fail. Channels that had been modified to maximize water capture during drought were suddenly overwhelmed by volumes far exceeding their capacity. Floodwaters carrying heavy loads of sediment poured through the network, depositing layers of sand and gravel that blocked carefully engineered passages. In some locations, the force of the water carved channels 8 meters deep into the landscape, cutting through embankments and severing connections between different parts of the system. One canal that had linked Angkor Thom and Angkor Wat to a port near Phnom Krom provides a particularly telling example of this destruction. Archaeological evidence shows that this waterway, essential for transportation and commerce, was rapidly filled with coarse debris deposited by a single catastrophic flood event. The sudden closure of this artery would have isolated the capital from a major water source and trading route, with immediate economic and logistical consequences. The question of how Angkor's population responded to these challenges has occupied scholars for decades. The traditional narrative held that the city was abandoned catastrophically following a military invasion by the Thai kingdom of Ayutthaya in 1431. According to this account, the sack of Angkor marked a sudden and decisive end to Khmer civilization, with the population fleeing southward en masse to escape foreign occupation. Recent archaeological evidence has complicated this picture considerably. Sediment cores extracted from the moat surrounding Angkor Thom reveal that indicators of human activity, including pollen from cultivated plants, charcoal from cooking fires, and evidence of soil erosion from agricultural land, all began declining as early as the first decades of the 14th century. By the end of that century, the moat was overgrown with vegetation, suggesting that maintenance had ceased. This timeline places the beginning of Angkor's decline more than a century before the Ayutthayan invasion. The emerging picture suggests not a sudden collapse, but a gradual, protracted transformation. The urban elite, those who controlled resources and directed labor, appear to have begun leaving Angkor during the 14th century, well before the infrastructure failed completely. Their departure may have been driven by multiple factors: the declining productivity of the agricultural system, the growing difficulty of maintaining the water management network, the shift of economic opportunity toward coastal trade routes, and perhaps the spread of Theravada Buddhism, which placed less emphasis on the monumental temple construction that had justified royal authority in previous centuries. As the elite departed, the labor and resources necessary to maintain the hydraulic infrastructure became increasingly scarce. This created a feedback loop in which declining maintenance led to further deterioration of the system, which in turn made the city less attractive to those with the means to leave. The common people, those without resources or connections to relocate, would have faced increasingly difficult conditions as the infrastructure that sustained their livelihoods crumbled around them. This interpretation suggests a profound irony in the fate of Angkor. The hydraulic system did not fail and cause the elite to leave. Rather, the elite left, and consequently, the hydraulic system failed. The infrastructure that had made Angkor possible was not a passive technology that operated automatically, but an active system requiring constant human attention, coordination, and investment. When that human commitment wavered, the system could not sustain itself. The Ayutthaya invasion of 1431, rather than causing Angkor's collapse, may have been opportunistic, taking advantage of a city already weakened by decades of decline. Thai forces besieged Angkor, for approximately 7 months before the Khmer king fled southward to establish a new capital near present-day Phnom Penh. The invaders occupied the city for perhaps 12 to 15 years before abandoning it themselves. By that point, Angkor had ceased to function as a viable urban center. The population that remained was a fraction of its former size, scattered among the ruins of an infrastructure that no one had the resources or organization to repair. Yet Angkor was never truly forgotten. Unlike many collapsed civilizations, whose remains lay buried for centuries before rediscovery, the temples of Angkor remained active religious sites throughout the centuries following the empire's decline. Angkor Wat itself was never completely abandoned. As the Khmer people converted to Theravada Buddhism during the 14th and 15th centuries, the temple was rededicated to the new faith and continued to function as a monastery. Buddhist monks maintained the site, and Khmer royalty periodically returned to pay respects to their ancestors and restore sacred images. This continuity of use preserved Angkor in collective memory, even as its political significance faded. Portuguese missionaries who visited in the 16th century wrote of encountering the ruins, though their accounts attracted little attention in Europe. It was not until French explorers arrived in the 1860s that Angkor entered Western consciousness, sparking fascination with what appeared to be a lost civilization swallowed by the jungle. This romantic narrative, while compelling, obscured the more complex reality of gradual transformation and persistent local connection to the site. The story of Angkor offers lessons that extend far beyond medieval Cambodia. It demonstrates how societies can become trapped by their own success, building infrastructure and institutions so large and complex that they become difficult to modify when conditions change. The Khmer water management system was a technological marvel, unmatched anywhere in the pre-industrial world. But its very sophistication made it vulnerable. It required specific environmental conditions to function properly, and it depended on sustained human investment to maintain. When either of these foundations weakened, the entire edifice became unstable. The pattern of climate stress that afflicted Angkor, alternating between prolonged drought and sudden flood, represents perhaps the most challenging scenario for any water management system. Designing for drought requires maximizing capture and storage, creating channels and reservoirs capable of holding every available drop. Designing for flood requires maximizing discharge, building spillways and outlets capable of handling sudden surges. Optimizing for one condition tends to compromise performance under the other. The Khmer engineers, facing unprecedented variability, found themselves repeatedly adapting their system in ways that created new vulnerabilities. Modern climate scientists have noted disturbing parallels between the conditions that stressed Angkor and projections for future climate change in many regions of the world. The same Pacific Ocean temperature patterns that brought megadroughts to medieval Cambodia continue to influence rainfall across Asia, affecting billions of people who depend on monsoon agriculture. Some researchers suggest that warming global temperatures may intensify these patterns, increasing the frequency of both extreme droughts and extreme floods. The largest pre-industrial city in history serves as a case study in what can happen when infrastructure designed for historical conditions encounters a climate that has shifted beyond its parameters. The transformation of Angkor also illustrates how human decisions shape the trajectory of societies under stress. The Khmer elite who began leaving the city in the 14th century were not irrational or cowardly. They were responding to incentives that made departure seem more attractive than staying. The maintenance of the hydraulic system required enormous collective investment for benefits that accrued to the population as a whole. As conditions deteriorated and the system became more difficult to maintain, the costs of that investment rose while the benefits became less certain. Those with resources to relocate increasingly chose to do so, leaving behind those without such options. This dynamic, in which individual rational choices produce collectively harmful outcomes, recurs throughout history. It reflects the fundamental challenge of maintaining complex systems that require sustained cooperation. Such systems function well when participants believe that their contributions will be matched by others and that the benefits of cooperation will be shared fairly. When that belief erodes, whether because of changing conditions, declining trust, or competing opportunities, the system can unravel with surprising speed. The Khmer state possessed considerable capacity to organize collective action, as evidenced by its construction of massive temples and elaborate water infrastructure. But that capacity depended on social arrangements, beliefs, and power structures that themselves required maintenance. The shift from Hindu and Mahayana Buddhist traditions, which emphasized royal authority and monumental construction, to Theravada Buddhism, which placed greater emphasis on individual spiritual practice, may have weakened the ideological foundations that had sustained collective investment in state projects. The growth of maritime trade created economic opportunities that did not depend on the agricultural surplus generated by the hydraulic system, giving elites alternative paths to prosperity that did not require maintaining the existing infrastructure. In this reading, the failure of Angkor's water management system was as much a social phenomenon as an engineering one. The technology itself remained functional, at least in principle. What failed was the social organization necessary to maintain it. And that failure was not a single catastrophic event, but a gradual erosion, a slow unwinding of commitments and capabilities that accumulated over decades until the point of no return was passed. Today, the temples of Angkor draw more than 1 million visitors each year. They come to marvel at the intricate stone carvings, the massive towers, the seemingly impossible scale of construction. But the most impressive achievement of the Khmer civilization lies largely invisible, beneath the landscape, the hydraulic network that made everything else possible. Modern mapping technologies, including aerial surveys and ground-penetrating radar, have revealed the full extent of this system, stretching far beyond what earlier researchers imagined. Efforts are now underway to restore portions of this ancient infrastructure. The North Bere, one of the 4 great reservoirs, was rehabilitated beginning in 2007 and has once again begun collecting water during the monsoon season. This project demonstrates that the technology developed by Khmer engineers nearly 1,000 years ago remains viable, capable of contributing to water management in the region if properly maintained. But restoration alone cannot address the deeper questions raised by Angkor's history. How do societies recognize when the systems they depend upon are approaching their limits? How do they mobilize collective action to adapt before it is too late? How do they balance the competing demands of those who benefit from existing arrangements and those who might benefit from change? These questions have no easy answers, and the experience of Angkor suggests that even the most sophisticated civilizations can fail to find them. The Khmer people did not disappear with the decline of Angkor. They adapted, relocating their political center southward to take advantage of new trade opportunities, transforming their religious practices, and developing new forms of social organization suited to changed circumstances. Their descendants continue to inhabit Cambodia today, maintaining connections to the temples and traditions of their ancestors. The fall of Angkor was not the end of Khmer civilization, but a transformation, a passage from one mode of existence to another. Perhaps this is the most important lesson of Angkor's story. Civilizations do not simply rise and fall like buildings that stand until they collapse. They evolve, adapt, and transform in response to changing conditions. The question is not whether change will come, but how it will be managed, whether societies will navigate transitions successfully or find themselves overwhelmed by forces they failed to anticipate or address. Angkor reminds us that even the greatest achievements of human organization remain contingent, dependent on conditions that cannot be taken for granted and relationships that require constant renewal. The stone faces that gaze from the towers of the Bayon have witnessed nearly 8 centuries of change since they were carved. They have seen the city they guarded transform from a thriving metropolis to an overgrown ruin and back again to a World Heritage Site. Their enigmatic expressions reveal nothing of what they have observed. But for those willing to look beneath the surface, to examine the sediment cores and tree rings and archaeological traces that preserve the record of the past, Angkor offers a warning and a challenge. The systems we build shape our possibilities, but they also create vulnerabilities. The decisions we make in response to changing conditions determine whether we adapt successfully or find ourselves, like the Khmer elite of the 14th century, watching the foundations of our world slowly give way beneath us. The monsoon rains still fall on the plains of Cambodia each year, as they have for millennia. The Tunnel Sap Lake still swells and rises with the seasons. The forces that made Angkor possible remain at work, as do the forces that ultimately undermined it. What remains to be seen is whether the societies of the present have learned what the Khmer discovered through painful experience, that mastery over nature is always provisional, that complexity creates fragility, and that the greatest achievements require not just construction, but constant committed maintenance. The temples of Angkor stand as monuments to what human beings can accomplish. The silence that surrounds them testifies to what happens when the commitment to sustain those accomplishments fails.